It's early 1069, and already William the Conqueror had seen off a rebel coalition outside of York, who had previously killed 2 of his lieutenants at actions in Durham and York itself. Robert de Cummins, along with 500 to 900 Flemish mercenaries, had been surprised and destroyed within Durham in January, the rebels quickly surrounding York and killing the castellan of York's castle, Richard, soon after. Though William swept up from the south to break up the blockade, he had ominously felt the troubles grave enough to send both his wife and son back home, while news slowly began to filter through to him of fresh plots and attacks. In Scotland, the rebel leadership of Malswain, Gospatrick and Edgar Atheling amassed a following and waited. They were likely waiting on news of the King of the Danes. Sweyn doubtless presented the greatest threat to the Norman conqueror's hold on the north, and perhaps even England itself. Sweyn Estrefson certainly had a decent royal pedigree. His mother Estrid was the daughter of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of the Danes and briefly King of England, making him the nephew of Canute, the earlier Danish King of England. Aside from his links to the House of Jelling, Adam of Bremen also writes that Edward the Confessor promised the throne to Sweyn, though it often seems he promised the crown to all the top contenders at one point or another. Sweyn at the time was the focus of many a rebel leader's hopes. Not only had the Northerners sought his support and aid, but even the Godwinson faction, under the de facto leadership of Guyfa, the Danish mother of King Harold Godwinson, sent money and pleas for assistance. However, despite the Danish king's likely ultimate designs, the arrival of the Danes in early September of 1069 was not a serious attempt to wrest the crown from William's bloody grip. Earlier on, before William's intervention in York, the English rebels had insisted the citizens there recognise Edgar as king, a move that makes little sense if the rebels really did back the Danish pretender. Sweyn also did not initially come himself. Perhaps mindful of the grisly fate of his late rival Harold Hardrada, he instead sent his brother Osbjorn with a fleet of 240 ships and 2 of Sweyn's sons, Harold and Canute, along with Christian, the Bishop of Aarhus. In addition, according to Orderic Vitalis, other nations supplied men to Sweyn's attack, including auxiliaries from Poland, Frisia, Saxony and Lithuania. Osbjorn traced the oft-sailed trail of destruction for Viking fleets, pressing the defences of Dover before attacking Sandwich further along the coast, and then Ipswich, where we know around 30 Danes were slain by the locals. At Norwich, he was driven back by Ralph of Gale, the Danes meeting stiff local resistance at every point. Since the Danish commander was systematically destroying any ships he encountered, he neutered William's ability to counter him at sea. It was sometime between mid-August and early September that Osbjorn arrived on the Humber and met with Edgar Atheling and his allies. The rebels, it was said, eagerly joined the Danes, with the host heading towards York. Eldred, the Archbishop of York, objected vocally to the whole business, he being an important detractor, given he had the ability to actually crown Edgar or any other pretender king. Fortunately for both the rebels and King William, in different ways, Eldred breathed his last on September 11th, the aged Archbishop worn out and done. Meanwhile, King William first heard news of the Danish fleet while hunting in the Forest of Dean. One consequence of the Danes taking the age-old route of raiding along the east coast was that King William had ample time to send word to York for his men there to prepare for the storm to come. In response, William Mallet optimistically wrote back that both castles could likely hold out for around a year. Mallet may have regretted his earlier assertion, as the true extent of the Anglo-Danish army became apparent. John of Worcester writes that, in an attempt to prevent their enemies from using the materials to fill the ditches surrounding the castles, the Norman defenders began torching surrounding buildings, though the flames spread throughout the place, engulfing the entire city, including the Minster. On Monday 21st of September, with the fires still burning, the Anglo-Danish army arrived at the scene. John further relates that the desperate garrison sallied out to meet them with some 3,000 Normans killed. Earl Wulfioth was said to have been particularly noted for his ferociousness that day, he alone dispatching many Normans during the battle, cutting off their heads as they emerged one by one through the gate. Notably, Gilbert de Ghent and William Mallet were spared, along with their immediate families, perhaps too important as hostages to be sacrificed to the bloodlust of the attackers. The Battle of York was to prove the single worst defeat for the Normans, and the rebels knew it. Edgar took the opportunity to send messages throughout England to open the wound further, the aim to drive the Normans fully from the kingdom. This was partially successful, but ultimately futile. The Norman mistake in burning York proved a double-edged sword that harmed both belligerents, as although it made victory easier for the Anglo-Danish, it also denied the same any stronghold from which to defy William when he inevitably came. Orderic writes that, quote, "Rumour exaggerated the fearful numbers of the enemy, who were said to be confidently awaiting battle with the king himself." This last point proved false, as far from confidently arraying themselves to meet William's mailed knights in the open field, the Danes had withdrawn away from York to the other side of the Humber. They were encamped in the marshy area known as the Isle of Axholme, clearly unwilling to engage the king directly. William meanwhile heard of further risings. Montacute, near Yeovil, was being attacked by men of Dorset and Somerset. Exeter, which William had himself subdued the year before, was being besieged by some men of Devon and Cornwall. Also Shrewsbury was enduring the attack of the Welsh, the men of Chester, as well as the locals. William Fitzosborne and Count Brian were initially deputed to deal with Shrewsbury, but merely met with fresh air, the rebels wisely melting back into hiding before promptly re-emerging once the Normans moved on towards Exeter. William was sufficiently concerned to march to Shrewsbury himself, crushing a large host of rebels at Stafford, while leaving his half-brother Robert to oversee the Danes. Marching back north, William learned the Danes had slipped away from Lincolnshire and may have moved again on the charred remains of York. His pursuit was complicated by the breaking of the bridge across the River Aire, the king only finding a suitable ford some 3 weeks later, and even then being fiercely resisted as they crossed. The diversion through marshy and wooded terrain delayed his arrival at York. In early December, he found that once more the Danes had fled. This persistent refusal of battle, but continued presence in the land, indicates a likely strategy of the Danes. They were to act as bridgehead, pioneers to hold the north, or at least part of it, in anticipation of King Sweyn's arrival. The planned base was likely York, the great northern city. However, Norman actions had effectively prevented this. Interestingly, a point against this was the fact that it had been the Anglo-Danes who had destroyed the 2 Norman castles in the burnt-out city. Back on their ships in the Humber, and with no means to assail them, William's deputies, Robert of Mortain and Robert of Eu, could only watch the Danes menacingly, though they took action to prevent their resupply by the sympathetic men of the local marshes. Though maybe not a classic impasse, as the Danes were becoming ragged through insufficient supplies, negotiation was still clearly a good course of action. Osbjorn was offered limited leave to forage in the Humber area, the Danes also permitted to remain in the area to sit out the winter months. The Danish leader was furthermore simply paid off, leaving William to turn his full wrath on the rebels of the region. As at Shrewsbury and before, the rebels merely melted away to the hills, woods and other hiding places, fully expecting their Norman foe to rebuild, reman his castles and return south. He did the former, but ominously not the latter. Instead, William divided his army into smaller parties, which spread out across 100 miles of land, going layer to layer through woods and high places to flush out and destroy nests of resistance. Yet this was only part of his intent. Orderic Vitalis writes further that, quote, "In his anger, William commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and food of every kind should be brought together and burned to ashes with consuming fire. so that the whole region north of the Humber might be stripped of all means of sustenance. The plan was to deny any local or foreign army the means with which to sustain itself, and would indeed prove cruelly effective. Orderic confirms that, quote, "As a consequence, so serious a scarcity was found in England, and so terrible a famine fell upon the humble and defenceless people, that more than 100,000 Christian folk of both sexes, young and old alike, perished of hunger." This punitive campaign was unambiguously a dark stain on the reign of William. John of Worcester describes the horrid desperation of the famished, with people consuming horses, cats, dogs, and even, in their blackest desperation, human flesh. Simeon of Durham reports that many willingly sold themselves into unending slavery just to escape the fate of starvation. Rake-like figures were said to have made it to Evesham Abbey in Worcestershire, only to die through eating too much. The monks of the abbey reported burying half a dozen bodies daily for a time. This event, known today as the Harrying of the North, was a direct and stark action that would scar the public consciousness to the present. Perhaps it's fitting to finish with the words of Orderic, who, unlike William's own chaplain and other major source of the error, William of Poitiers, does not mince his words. Quote, "For this act, which condemned the innocent and guilty alike to die by slow starvation, I cannot commend him. For when I think of helpless children, young men in the prime of life, and hoary greybeards perishing alike of hunger, I am so moved to pity that I would rather lament the grief and sufferings of the wretched people than make a vain attempt to flatter the perpetrator of such infamy. Moreover, I declare that assuredly such brutal slaughter cannot remain unpunished, for the Almighty Judge watches over high and low alike. He will weigh the deeds of all in an even balance, and as a just avenger punish wrongdoing, as the eternal law makes clear to all men."